Straight Edges. Chapter 6, In the Beginning God Created, Part 2. Let's take a closer look at what we've been taught about this theory of evolution and talk about a couple of problems I see with it. The way I see it, evolution has two main problems: an evidence problem and an addition problem. I'm no scientist, so I should leave this stuff alone, but you don't have to be a scientist to know a hawk from a handsaw. And I can't get around evolution's two main problems. First, the evidence problem. I like what G.K. Chesterton said once: "I do not find men now so eager to prove things, but at the most to assure me that they have been proved." He wrote that a few years ago, but I haven't noticed things to have changed much since then. I've heard the fact of evolution compared to the fact of the Earth going around the sun, and those who doubt said fact of evolution compared to those who doubt the Earth going around the sun. But I've heard very little to show me why evolution should be considered a fact. I mean, if what was meant by evolution was simply change, then yeah, I would have a hard time denying that everything does in fact change. For the worse, generally, as the second law of thermodynamics shows us. Or if what was meant by natural selection was simply that if anything survives, it will most likely be the fittest, I could agree that it seems a logical proposition. But those basics are not what's meant when people talk about evolution and natural selection, and it's what people talk about as evolution and what the textbooks teach us that I'm not convinced by. Because I like hard evidence, I'm into that. And the question of whether macroevolution happened must always remain a question of history, not science and observation. After all, who's got a spare million or so years to hang around waiting to see if it really happens the way we're told it did? But as a question of history, if macroevolution happened, the first place we would look for evidence would be the fossil record. Although we hear so much about the fact of all the fossil evidence that supports evolution, we don't hear much about the fossil evidence itself. Or what I do hear about the fossil evidence leaves me skeptical and wondering about the bias of those discovering and classifying the fossil evidence. For a random hypothetical example, when I learned that the nearly conclusive fossil evidence in an almost perfect evolutionary chain between two life forms as deceptively seemingly distant as, say, hyenas and, say, whales, consists of a grand total of, say, 4 fossil species, all of which either look a whole lot like a whale or a whole lot like a hyena, I don't find myself exactly compelled by the evidence. But then I always have been able to tell a hawk from a handsaw and a whale from a hyena. Are those fossil links really linking anything? You and I can probably name a few examples of missing links that have been discovered, finds like Lucy, Archaeopteryx, and Eohippus. You know why they're famous? Because they're so rare. Here's a riddle for you. What do you call a chain made up of missing links? Give up? Me too. I don't know what you'd call it, but I don't think you could call it a chain. Is there really a chain of evolution? In recent decades, punctuated equilibrium has come to be a popular idea. It goes something like this. We don't see a whole lot of transitional forms in the fossil record to show us how evolution happened. Therefore, evolution happened in such a way that we shouldn't expect to see a whole lot of transitional forms in the fossil record. Cool. A scientific theory that does away entirely with the need for evidence. Without any cold hard evidence, we have what we may still call science, but I myself would have to tack on fiction. Shouldn't transitional species in the fossil record vastly outnumber the fossil species clearly belonging to one class or another? If birds evolved from reptiles, there would have been so many steps on the road to birdhood that there should have been far more in-betweens than true reptiles or true birds. But this is simply not what the fossil record shows. So let's suppose that the majority of reptile species remained reptiles and only a handful started down the long dusty road to birddom. But the main premise of Darwinism is that evolution works by encouraging favorable changes through natural selection. The theory falls apart once a person begins answering evolution's evidence problem by saying things like, Well, the members of the transitional species never became very numerous, so very few of them were preserved in the fossil record. Shouldn't the favorable changes cause the transitioning forms to become numerous, more numerous than their less favored counterparts? Any way you slice it, the fossil record has not yielded the kind of fossil evidence, the only hard evidence possible, that evolution needs in order to stand as a viable theory of natural history. If you, at this moment, are protesting violently, okay, so there are only 3 transitional forms, but how do you explain away those 3? And, of course, I'm overstating, or do I mean understating? I mean, I'm hyperbolizing, but anyway, 3 that I can think of off the top of my head. Maybe I should take a few paragraphs to explain how I can sleep at night knowing about the existence of Archaeopteryx, Lucy, and Eohippus. Well, one was a weird bird, but all birds are weird. One was a weird primate, but all primates are weird. And one was some other extinct mammal that looks weird to us now because there are no more. And okay, so maybe all mammals are weird too. That's how I explain them. Maybe transitional fossils only exist because A. People are eager to believe in evolution, and in order to do so, they simultaneously B. Make too much of any likenesses, and C. Make too much of any differences. I mean, they see any likenesses as family resemblance, and see any variations in organisms as transitional. As far as jumping to conclusions on the basis of likeness, I know a lot of people like that, determined to find family resemblance. As soon as a baby is born, he must look just like at least one of his parents, if not both. It can be embarrassing for these people when they meet parents with their adopted children and, not realizing the children are adopted, immediately begin noticing family resemblances. Resemblance can be found anywhere as long as you look hard enough for it, but resemblance doesn't prove relationship. Logically, where no relationship is known, and no relationship can be known that's millions of years old, seeing similarity as proof of relationship is necessarily a matter of philosophy. We believe what we want to believe. But arguing in favor of what I believe is the fact that even those who want to believe in transitional forms can find so few of them. Similarities at the DNA level are especially touted as proof of evolution. But if 2 organisms show similarities in their body plans, those similarities will be reflected in their DNA. And the same principle applies. Where no relationship is known, seeing similarity as proof of relationship is a matter of philosophy. It doesn't surprise me that all living things have similarities. We all live in a similar manner on the same planet designed by the same designer. Legs, wings, and fins are similar because they're all used for the same thing. They are locomotion tools, and the general design of those tools is the design that works for locomotion. As to making too much of differences, a lot hinges on definitions of species, and those definitions are muddy. A rough guide for determining what should be considered a true species is based on sexual reproduction and propagation. If 2 different organisms can reproduce sexually and their offspring are fertile, those organisms are generally considered members of the same species. But how could there be a hard and fast rule for determining the species of fossils? How could that rough guide help when fossils are dug up and need to be classified as belonging to one species or another? The fact is, fossils aren't dug up with placards bearing their Latin names. The names and the categories are man-made. What we see is that the genetic code allows for seemingly infinite variations and changes. Nothing produces offspring that's a carbon copy of itself, and that room for variation seemed to be even greater in the past. We'll discuss that a little more in a minute. I have no problem admitting that one species can come from another species, given the muddiness of species. I mean, within any given species, there is a lot of room for variety. And at some point, those different varieties may be divergent enough to be considered different species. So I can agree with the theory of evolution in its theory of the origin of species, insofar that one species could come from another species. Say that all different species of canine creatures could come from one species of canine creatures. Where I can't agree with the theory of evolution and where I believe it has an evidence problem is in saying that all species of everything could have come from one species, or from no species at all. There was nothing wrong with Darwin's basic observations except for the speculative territory he took them into, to go from the origin of species to the origin of life itself. Do we have to see all strange creatures such as Archaeopteryx or the platypus as half of one thing and half of another, as one form transitioning into another? Or could we see all creatures as unique, originating in the imagination of an incredibly inventive and hilariously creative mind, who went out of his way to make a mockery of all our neat and tidy man-made little categories? In short, I think there are people who madly want to find transitional forms, and so find them. After all, they are the ones giving them the names and classifying them. That's my not terribly technical or scientific explanation of transitional forms, but after all, I was supposed to tell you how I manage to sleep at night, and that's how I do it. What I'm curious about is how Dr. So-and-so, shall we say Humpenschlinkel, manages to sleep, knowing about all the transitional forms that aren't out there that should be. Now, let's talk about evolution's second problem, an addition problem. Evolution has to have a mechanism for addition in order for the theory to work, but all we see in nature is subtraction. People like to talk about natural selection as though that's all the mechanism evolution needs, but natural selection can only select. It's no mechanism for addition. It can only choose between already existing varieties or species. It can't create them. It can further those that already exist by taking away the less fit to survive, but extinction equals subtraction. Also, natural selection is really no help at all in explaining how all the marvels of nature could have come about gradually, one step at a time. I can see that sight is an advantage over blindness, and that natural selection might reward the possessors of sight with a better survival rate than the blind. But what advantage could half an eye be over no eye? Half a loaf is better than none because it's still half a loaf, but half an eye is no eye at all. Why would natural selection reward all the in-between stages from blindness to sight when it had no idea that sight would ever happen? Blind chance must have been very far-sighted indeed to know that anything like an eye could ever have been produced. Natural selection has never been intended to be evolution's mechanism for addition. Darwin knew that there must be some kind of mechanism for addition that would give natural selection something to work on. He speculated on its nature this way. Under domestication, we see much variability. This seems to be mainly due to the reproductive system being eminently susceptible to changes in the conditions of life, so that this system, when not rendered impotent, fails to reproduce offspring exactly like the parent form. Variability is governed by many complex laws, by correlation of growth, by use and disuse, and by the direct action of the physical conditions of life. Charles Darwin, The Origin of the Species, Penguin Classics, 1985, page 440. In Darwin's day, there was less known about inherited traits. It seemed reasonable to think that adaptation and acquired characteristics could account for evolution. Salamanders living in caves lost their eyesight from disuse. Giraffes grew long necks by stretching them to reach the leaves from the tops of trees after the lower leaves had been eaten off, that kind of thing. Characteristics acquired from the environment were then passed on. It all sounded plausible, until a monk named Gregor Mendel came along. Mendel experimented with peas about the same time Darwin was observing his pigeons. Mendel showed us something about genetics that blew the idea of acquired characteristics out of the water. Genes allow for mixing and matching and cultivating or accentuating traits, but those differences and traits are all possible because of the genetic code and are written into it in some form. Now we know that environment can't cause change in an organism. All environment can do is kill off or reduce in number the organisms that happen to be unfit for that environment. For example, we see that the only animals that live in the far north have special characteristics that enable them to survive in that harsh environment. Is that because of the harsh environment? Would moving to the North Pole cause you to grow thick fur? No, moving to the North Pole would only cause you to die if you didn't already have thick fur, or if you couldn't otherwise adapt to the environment by, for instance, killing and wearing something that has thick fur. Conditions don't alter the beaks of finches. They alter populations by killing off or reducing the number of finches who have beaks that make them unfit for the conditions. Now that we've learned a thing or two about genetics, that's what Darwin's work on natural selection boils down to. Every living organism to varying degrees can adapt to its environment, but those adaptations happen because we are all programmed for adaptation, showing us again the marvelous design of our genetic code. Take our immune system and its production of antibodies, for example. But that capability for adaptation is already built in, it's not addition. Now we know a giraffe may be able to lengthen his own neck slightly by stretching it. There are still places in the world where people do the same thing with their own necks. They gradually add ring after ring around the collar, and eventually their necks are unnaturally long. Their babies are born with quite normal necks, and the process starts all over again with them. Evolution needs a mechanism of addition to increase complexity in the genetic code, to move from an amoeba to an accountant. Adaptation and acquired characteristics don't cut it because they simply don't alter the genetic code. From all observation, we can see no examples of addition to the genetic code. Take Darwin's observations, for example. What we see from his work is the loss of genetic information, not the increase. Darwin's work with pigeons and so on to show that varieties can harden into what we call species, and that many species may come from one parent species, shows us subtraction when combined with what we now know about genetics. If some doggy ancestors carried the raw genetic information for Great Danes and poodles and every other canine, there's been a loss of genetic information, because today we would be very surprised if Mr. and Mrs. Poodle could produce anything other than baby poodles. A poodle does not seem to carry all the genetic information that must have been carried by the original doggy parents. Successive generations have lost genetic information present in the first canines. Maybe it's true that new species were formed out of the original species, but so what? The greater number of narrowly defined species, unable to pass on that broader spectrum of genetic information, the less the genetic information. Of course it makes sense that the genetic information passed on will be less and less with every generation. And given the fact of the second law of thermodynamics, that's what we should expect. The second law applies to genetics, too. The only possible mechanism that science has discovered so far, the only thing known to alter genes, is called mutation. So the new Darwinism says that the giraffe was a mutant with an abnormally long neck who was more fit to survive because it could eat the leaves off the tops of the trees. The polar bear was a mutant who grew abnormally thick fur and so was able to survive at the North Pole. Certain salamanders are blind due to mutation and are able to survive only in caves where the competition for survival is less fierce, and they're less likely to get eaten. There's sense to that one. The amoeba underwent millions and millions of years of millions upon millions of mutations, and out popped the accountant. Problem is that the mechanism is still the problem. For some obscure reason, I would not be highly complimented if you called me a mutant. You might very well mean it as a compliment. You might simply mean that I was more evolved than you, but I doubt it. Probably you would be trying to tell me that I had some kind of defect that was making me less fit for survival. That's what we associate with the word mutant, and for good reason. That seems to be so far what mutations produce. If you called me a mutant, you would probably be right. Like the blind salamanders in caves, I do have inherited traits that at some point in my lineage were probably produced by mutation, like weak vision and asthma. Mutations are also not additions to information in the genetic code. They're subtractions. Mutations are really printing errors in the genetic code. They're typos, if you like. I should be the expert on typos. I can't get through a sentence without one. I can tell you that I've performed experiment after experiment with my own personal mutations of the written word, and they keep on refusing to add information. Some may be funny, some would be downright embarrassing if I left them alone. They may add some unintentional humor, but not one has ever added any useful information. None has ever worked towards clearing up any of the confusion I may have created for the reader. I can say that not once have I accidentally typed something that I looked at and said to myself, "Hey, I'm going to keep that one. That's a much better thought than what I originally intended." There's no getting around it. If our amoeba is ever going to become an accountant, there must be an addition of information. Somehow the genetic code must be added to, and the only mechanism so far discovered, mutation, just doesn't seem to be useful as a mechanism for addition. When I try to imagine it all out, to imagine the engineering ability of the spider and the Venus flower basket, or the migrating instincts of the salmon and the monarch butterfly, or the food dance of the honeybee, coming about through random mutations acted upon by natural selection, my imagination balks. And I have a pretty agile imagination, just not that agile. Evolutionists necessarily speak airily about adaptation in vague generalities with a great deal of hand-waving and glossing over. Can you imagine the exponential number of problems involved in trying to do the science to demonstrate how it all could have worked? For just one of my examples listed above. But to be considered science, evolution would have to work out the demonstration over and over and over and over again for every species of life on Earth. If what I'm saying about evolution's two problems is true, we have a case of science telling us that we don't have anything to show us it happened, and we don't have anything to show us how it happened, but we just know that it must have happened. Thank you, but if that's what's being sold, I'm not buying. And those are only the problems with evolution after we imagine it getting itself going. I have yet to mention the main problem with a purely naturalistic version of evolution. The most die-hard of evolutionists has so far been stumped for even a speculation as to how it could have got itself going. To go from the simplest life form to all the vast complexity we see around us is a baby step compared to the nightmare of a challenge that faces the atheistic evolutionist in trying to explain how life without any help could have arisen from non-life. That's a step across the Grand Canyon. Oddly enough, no one has yet managed it. Could all the seeming order and design and complexity and beauty of the natural world and of life all have come about through no other cause than natural selection, acting on an enormous collection of typos, acting on a primordial ooze? I can only imagine all that happening if one admits to a designer and intelligence back of it all. Our natural order is undoubtedly a miracle, but no explanation for its formation is more miraculous than the one which says there was no God involved in it. But as a matter of fact, miracles go on all the time, every day. The miracle of the proverbial swallowing of the proverbial camel is going on all around us as we speak. Can you admit with me that evolution without a God in the picture is really a pretty good-sized camel that people are eager to get down? As long as they don't have to choke down the gnat that sticks in the craw. The gnat being an admittance of a God in the picture. The point of this chapter is not to convince you that evolution couldn't possibly have happened. The point of this chapter is just that I'm hoping to convince you that there must be a God. Even if evolution happened the way we're told it did, there still must be a God. It's interesting to me to hear well-educated, intelligent people on this subject. No one can deny the high level of order, precision, and complexity that exists in our natural world. The only debate possible is surrounding the issue of how all that seeming design could have come to be. Generally, everywhere else we see order and precision, we assume it's being done on purpose and think no more about it. It's only when it comes to this really gigantic question of all the order and precision in the universe that we make bones about it. No pun intended. We all agree on the order and precision, but beyond that the bobbing and weaving begins, and all the arguments take the form of could have happens. These arguments are very sophisticated ones, I admit. The amazing feats of mental gymnastics used to get around the obvious remind me of my favorite brand of fiction, the whodunit. In the whodunit, the obvious is always the wrong answer, and the least likely suspect is always the right answer. The more unlikely, the better. The more amazing the feat of mental gymnastics, the more fun. And that's because it's fiction. You also have to remember that in whodunits, as well as in true crime stories, the red herrings and false scents and frame-ups are all intentional because either the author or the guilty party doesn't want to be found out. Are we really supposed to believe that nature somehow managed to lay out a trail of red herrings and frame-ups to make everything look so convincingly like it was designed by a designer? Blind chance plus natural selection is certainly the least likely suspect, and a designer-creator is certainly the obvious choice. If our universe was a fiction story, then blind chance would have my vote for whodunit. As we're talking about reality here, I'll go with the obvious choice. Don't we usually accept the obvious and the most likely as the truth, if all the facts point in that direction? This is the one area where people are anxious to make an exception. All the purpose and design in the natural order is one thing that's so convincing to me that there must be a God. These things couldn't have just happened. Not in reality. Well then, is it sensible to leave it there, to say, okay, so there's a God of some sort, and have no further curiosity, when the first sensible question that any sensible person wants to know is all about cause and purpose? And that brings us back to why. Because if we admit that God created all those other strange and hilariously inventive creations, you know what that means, don't you? That means having to admit that God created me. And you. If all those other creations are so laden with purpose and design on a natural level, doesn't that make you wonder about your purpose? Why? Why? Why were we created? I don't think it's sensible to go the route of admitting, possibly, even probably, there might be a God, but then stop short of learning anything about him. For one thing, it goes against inquisitive human nature and that first sensible question we want to know. And for another thing, he just may have some interest in our knowing why, if we were created for a purpose. Now that may sound very egocentric or very terracentric. After all, Earth is hardly the center of the universe. There's an emotional reaction we have to the idea that a God of the universe could possibly be interested in us. There's a line from a movie I was watching tonight that's still rattling around in my head. I find it impossible to believe the creator of the universe could take any notice of germs like us. But why wouldn't he take notice of germs like us, if he can even take notice of germs? At every level of life, we see a complexity in design that bears witness to a designer. If he would create a sponge that can build towers that make the Eiffel Tower look like child's play, why is it unbelievable that he takes notice of humanity? I have to admit that I have no idea why a creator of the universe should take notice of us, or germs, or sponges, but when I'm told that whether or not he should, he does, I don't refuse to believe it, at least not based on the size of the universe and our own smallness argument. If he's the God of the galaxies, he's also the God of the electrons. The God of the infinitely big would also be the God of the infinitely small, if God is infinite. And as massive and mentally overpowering as the universe is, the pockets of habitation in it are going to be the sites of greatest interest, wouldn't you say? Surely life, no matter the size, is going to be of more importance than non-life. The immensity of the universe should tell us something about the significance of God, rather than the insignificance of ourselves. Of course it's impossible for us to talk about God in anything other than understatement, and it is certainly a mistake to talk as though we, ourselves, are the center of the universe. If there is a God, he is the center of the universe. Accepting that is a giant leap for mankind type of mental step, but I don't think we can legitimately use our own smallness as one more escape route to avoid taking that step. Not when it's he himself telling us that, for whatever reason, he does in fact take a great deal of trouble about us. If the very center of the universe stoops to take notice of us, for us to deny him the right to do it on the grounds that we think he couldn't possibly, it is not humility, but simply insult. He, you might be asking at this point, why not she, it, them? At the point we've got to so far, we really wouldn't know what pronoun to use. For the sake of brevity, I'm going to keep on referring to him as him. That's what I'm used to, and writing he, she, it, them is very cumbersome. What pronoun to use is just a small part of the things we don't know about God yet. Maybe we should start by trying to agree on some sort of definition for the word God. I looked it up in the dictionary, and that didn't prove to be extraordinarily enlightening. But I thought for a nice simple definition we could agree on the one in control. That should pretty much cover all our bases, shouldn't it? That covers the ancient type gods. The god of the sea was the one in control of the sea. The god of fertility was the one in charge of fertility, and so forth. Of course, when I talk about God, I'm talking about the one in charge of the universe, the one in ultimate control, and that is usually what is meant when we use the word. Now, within that range, there may be lots of different ideas about God. Let's talk about a popular one at the moment. The most popular idea of God I've run into lately is an impersonal one. God is a kind of a force, the energy behind the universe, that type of idea. Or maybe God is just everything there is. Everything that exists is God by virtue of its existence. God is all, and all is God. The nice thing about all being God is that, in that case, I am part of God, seeing I am part of all. Very flattering. I'm really my own God then, aren't I? I'm the one in control of me, after all. This comes up again. It ends up not being so nice in the end. After all, if all is God, and I, being part of all, am also God, then all I can say about the situation is that God is in a bit of a mess, and there's no one left to get him, her, it out of it. But I'm ahead of myself again. I hear people talk about the universe, or life, or nature, or energy, and ascribe to these impersonal controllers all kinds of acts and attributes that I would assign to God. My definition still works. This popular idea of God still admits to this God being in control of everything. God is the force or energy controlling the universe. What doesn't work is the popular idea itself. The popular idea is mystical and blurred around the edges. The hope is that one won't have to define God, or worse yet, know too much about him, her, it. Ignorance is bliss, apparently, when it comes to this matter of God. It seems that the point to believing in this kind of a controller of the universe, or the universe itself, is A, an admittance of the fact that there must be more to life, the universe, and everything than the merely material. B, an admittance that everything couldn't have come about just through pure luck. And C, an attempt to escape any kind of personal responsibility to this controller of the universe. This is a God that comes with no strings attached. If God is an impersonal force, if God is who knows what, but if God is at least completely unknowable, then this controller of the universe doesn't have very much control over my life. Phew! I can do what I want. If God is independent of the universe, if God is a person, if God is mind, then perhaps God is knowable. Then perhaps he wants to make himself known to me. Then perhaps I may be accountable to him. Then perhaps I can't run my own life. He might have some say in the matter of my life, if he made it. If he is God, the one in control, then he might be in control of me, and that will never do. Why do I say that the popular idea about this nice, comfortable, impersonal, non-knowable, and non-interfering type of God doesn't work? For objections to God as non-personal read objections to God as non-existent. If God is not personal, not mind, not intelligence, then he, she, it, for all intents and purposes, is exactly the same as no God at all. That kind of God may be able to give people a warm, fuzzy notion that there are spiritual realities of some sort, but that kind of a God couldn't create a blessed thing beyond a warm, fuzzy notion. The problem with trying to believe in a life force kind of God as a way of getting around the obvious design and intelligence we see everywhere is that a mindless life force couldn't design DNA, couldn't design an eye, couldn't design a brain. All couldn't design and create itself. I couldn't even create myself. I have very little control over even my own reality, as already discussed. The God that created the universe was super intelligent, super powerful, and supernatural. That's what I see when I look at the evidence. God may certainly be more than mind, whatever that means. I've no doubt that's true, even though I don't know what it means, but he could hardly be less than mind. To me, it seems so plain and simple that the easiest and smartest thing to do is give in and admit that there must be a God and that he's more like a person or a mind than any other alternative. But that's me. I am a plain and simple kind of person. I don't know if you're with me, but think about it for yourself. Try to set aside any bias you may have and decide for yourself what makes the most sense. Wrestle it through on your own. From now on, though, I'll be writing as if we've agreed on this most basic of all biblical concepts. In the beginning, God.